Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome this fine night to the Francis Humphrey Lecture Series. It's wonderful to see a full house again. We've been really getting a lot of great attendance from our membership and others who have been interested in our programming, and we have a great program tonight. And it's a special thing for me tonight that I can introduce Jan Loveren, a friend and a colleague. I was just thinking before coming up here, I met Jan back in the early 1980s when she was a graduate student and I was working at the Nevada Historical Society. And then she started working here in 1985. So she's the second longest serving staff member. Who do you think is the first? So tonight, Jan's going to be presenting this great topic on Victorian fashions. I'd like to give you a little background on her career here. Jan is a graduate of University of Nevada. She has an MS in Home Economics and Museum Studies from the University of Nevada. She's published widely in two publications I want to mention because we were co-publishers on those. Was To Clothe Nevada Women, 1860 to 1920. And the other one was kind of a fun article that we worked together on. It was a women's series on women up on the Comstock Lode in Virginia City. And the title of that is Comstock Needleworkers in Comstock Women, the Making of a Mining Community. Jan is a member of the Costume Society of America and the International Council of Museums Costume Committee, and has presented papers all over the United States and a couple times outside the countries. I'm really promoting her today. So at this time, let me turn the program over to Jan. Thank you.
I was going to say, as I look out in the audience, most of you know me. Some of that's a little embellished, but this is a fun, I think, and engaging talk. So this is Victorian fashions and dress reform. What are known as Victorian fashions are truly beautiful. Many of you have come to the Textile Center and I've shared with you many aspects of our collection. The fabrics are rich, there's a lot of lace, embellishment. They truly are something to behold to the eyes. This is Empress Eugenie of France and her court in the mid-19th century. And you can see here the styles are romantic. They're flounces, full, elaborate, and really lovely to look at. But one of the things that you will notice about these garments is their actual size. Many of these dresses from the 19th century are extraordinarily small. Some of them have an 18-inch waist and a 28-inch bust. It's tough to look at, trust me. Within the 50 years of the Victorian period, the fashionable silhouette changed many times. This is a Jean-Philippe Worth walking suit from 1898, and you can see that it is a very formal ensemble with a waist, which is like the blouse, a bodice jacket, full-length skirt, and a chatelaine is hanging down from her waist. And she, of course, is carrying her walking stick. And yet, how realistic were these garments? Could you really play badminton in a full-length dress like this with a train? Besides what you see here, you would have still had on drawers, a chemise, hoop skirt, corset cover, probably a couple of petticoats, and your hosiery. So these fashions are from Harper's Bazaar, and they're titled Country Toilettes, 1868. Or perhaps ice skating or roller skating. Could you have really skated in these 1870s styles? Movement certainly would be inhibited. And can you imagine balancing the hat? I mean, really, keeping it on your head? But this is also from Harper's, and it is dated 1876. And yet the fashions from 150 years ago were beautiful, exquisite from our way of thinking, but rather unfunctional. But they did provide a function and a meaning for 19th century society, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, or this evening. This was the period of the newly emerging middle class. This Up until this time in history, there was really only the aristocracy and then the lower folk. But now, in the middle of the 19th century, everyone could have an opportunity to acquire and gain wealth, status, and prestige. And this, of course, relates to the Industrial Revolution. We now came in from the farms. There were factories. We could make a little bit more money, and we could increase our status. There's a theory called conspicuous consumption. Let me say that again, conspicuous consumption. And it was created by the noted sociologist Thorstein Veblen, who basically said women's fashions were said to reflect the success of her husband. Every woman wanted fancy, elaborate clothing because it represented prosperity, achievement, wealth, and status. This sketch is by, actually, I just skipped a little bit. This is Mary Matthews McNair, who was a conservative Irish widow who lived on the Comstock in the 1870s. In her book, she makes reference to the power of fashionable dress when her neighbor, Mrs. Calvin, tells her, she said, if you would just go down in that old stocking and get out some of the gold you have hoarded up and put it on your back in fine clothes, you would stand some show to get a rich husband, for then they would know that you had something, and now they don't think you're worth anything. So not much has changed in terms of fashion for that. The fashionable idea of beauty in this 19th century did not go unchallenged, however. Bloomers, originally referred to as bifurcated garments, became a trend in the country in the 1850s. Mrs. Miller, a woman named Mrs. Miller, who was a cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, began wearing this type of garment when she returned from Europe, where it was commonly worn by women in sanitariums. Hardly a fashion item. But Mrs. Stanton was impressed when she saw her cousin dressed in this new outfit because she safely climbed a set of stairs with an infant in one arm and a kerosene lamp in the other. And if you think about that, in a full-length garment that comes down to your ankle, to try to juggle that and go upstairs, this kind of costume was revolutionary. It was really something. According to the story, Mrs. Stanton made herself a similar outfit, exclaiming, "What freedom I enjoyed! Like a captive set free from his ball and chain. I am now ready for a brisk walk through the sleet and snow and rain, to climb a mountain, to jump over a fence, or work in the garden." Just by shortening the skirt and adding trousers underneath. At the same time, a newspaper had written a satirical article on women's dress and had jokingly suggested that women should shorten their skirts and wear pants. Mrs. Amelia Jenks Bloomer responded to this article in her newspaper called The Lily. She also designed a paper pattern for this new garment. The press picked up on the idea, and the name Bloomers became attached to Mrs. Bloomer. Bloomers were popular for several years with many women, and this slide shows many fashionably dressed women at a picnic. But in the center of the slide, and I'm going to walk over here, you can see those two women right there. They are wearing bloomers, and no one is associated with them. They are by themselves. The National Dress Reform Association was created in 1856. And I think it's funny, we think of gun reform, tax reform, and here we have dress reform. The National Dress Reform Association was established in 1856, and in that same year, an event was held in which over 3,000 women attended dressed in the bloomer costume. There were torchlight parades by dress reformers in support of this newfound freedom. Bloomers did create quite a stir, however. Many of these trouser-wearing women were publicly ridiculed, were the subject of many rude jokes, and even had rocks and stones thrown at them. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in their younger years did wear the bloomer costume. But the length of time that bloomers were actually fashionable was very short, under 3 years. Stanton and Anthony continued to wear them a bit longer for as long as 8 years, but both women realized that the wearing of this controversial dress was counterproductive to the real issue of women's rights and suffrage, so they went back to wearing traditional fashion. Modifications of the bloomer costume did continue and were worn by pioneers. Set in the dead of winter, this pioneer woman has chosen to warm her legs in her trousers and shorten her skirt. But note the trousers are not gathered like they were in the previous images. They are just straight-legged at this point. Nevada's own Hannah Clapp was said to have worn bloomers when she too crossed the prairie. And a woman named Mrs. Miriam Holt stated, quote, "I can bound over prairies like an antelope and not in as much danger of setting my clothing on fire while cooking." For the most part, bloomers were out of style or out of fashion by the 1860s, except for a few extremists who remained. This is Mary Tillotson, charter member of the National Dress Reform Association, again, which was founded in 1856. She is holding a copy of the charter in her hand. The National Dress Reform Association supported freedom in dress and realized that women's fashions were unhealthy and prevented women from doing many physical activities. One dress reformer who did gain national attention was Marietta Stowe. Mrs. Stowe ran for vice president of the United States of America, along with presidential candidate Belva Lockwood. This is in the 1880s. You can see here that Mrs. Stowe is wearing fashionable 1880s attire, but modified with trousers underneath. So why didn't the bloomers take hold? Most of the women in this room were all wearing pants. What happened? Why didn't it catch on? What caused it to literally be out of style in 3 years? Well, the answer is multifaceted, but primarily trousers were associated with masculinity. And here in this image, and it's too bad it's not a little bigger, we couldn't see it, it's called the Discord. And it's a caricature asking, who will wear the pants? The central male figure exclaims, "Rather die than let my wife have my pants." A man ought always to be ruler. And then the woman on the other side says, "Woman is born to rule and not obey those contemptible creatures called men." The entire issue of wearing established clothing mores was established to sexual roles and separate spheres. The wearing of bifurcated garments, and bifurcated means like right leg, left leg too, was definitely a man's garment, and its entire masculinity and identity was challenged by women taking on his garments, his clothes. In this slide, entitled "The Bloomer Dance," instruction is given on how to dance with this newly bloomerized woman. We were new creatures. The wearing of bloomers was not immediately successful because it was associated with strong-minded women, and strong-minded women did not uphold the fashionable ideal of beauty in the 19th century. Perpetuating this was the biblical quote from Deuteronomy, which says, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination under the Lord thy God." Another reason bloomers did not become immediately acceptable has to do with underwear. In the 19th century, women's drawers were split up the crotch, as this slide shows. There is a right leg, a left leg, a waistband, but it is truly crotchless underwear. So when a woman was wearing a full-length dress, it was relatively easy to relieve yourself. You could spread your legs and with crotchless underwear remain totally modest and respectable. But with bloomers on, that creates another problem. You would have to expose your torso, and in the 19th century, that just would have not been appropriate. But the primary reason that bloomers never became a dominant fashion was because it was not considered attractive by most women. We didn't like it. It did not make you feel good. It did not improve your figure or make you more attractive to a man. And so the popularity of bloomers dramatically declined. At the same time that bloomers went out of fashion, the hoop skirt or crinoline was created. This alleviated all the weight created by those petticoats. And so in some respect, the crinoline replaced the need for bifurcated garments, as women could now walk with much more ease. And yet the crinoline created its own fashion problems. And you can see here how wide those hoops became, so that the ladies' escort is actually walking on the outside of the staircase. And here in this image, you can see that there are ladies on the right-hand side of the slide, and I think on the left, on ladders, lowering the dress over the wide hoops. So it became sort of absurd. Although the crinoline did allow for more freedom in dress, they were also very hazardous. In England, there were over 40,000 women's deaths attributed to wearing the crinoline. And here in Nevada, in Gold Hill, and I just cite this from Bob, he found me an article years ago that said there was a woman named Bridget Carmen in Gold Hill was killed when the hoop from her crinoline became entangled in the shaft of the mine's millworks, and she was repeatedly beaten to death. So these are hazardous attire. By the 1870s, the issues of bloomers declines, and it becomes focused on into the health of women's fashions. This is fashionable dressmaker Mary Malloy. Was it really healthy to look like this? To be tightly corseted with an 18 or 20-inch waist? Was it healthy for women's dresses to drag the ground, crumbing up, creating dirt and vermin? Was it healthy for women's dresses to hang tightly from their waist, which was already constricted? The Dress Reform Association began renewed efforts at altering women's clothing by questioning the structure that created them, exactly underwear. The dress reformers felt that underwear should provide warmth, support the torso, leave the vital organs unimpeded, preserve a uniform body temperature, reduce the weight of clothing, and the one I love the best is suspend the hosiery from your shoulders. The one aspect of altering women's underwear was the idea of maintaining a stable body temperature. Women had for years been frequently more ill than men. Women fainted, we were the weaker sex, and researchers were looking for reasons to explain this. Dr. Gustav Jaeger felt that maintaining a stable body temperature would increase women's health, so he developed the idea that all undergarments touching the human figure should be made of wool, as wool absorbed body perspiration. This was actually pretty important as women were starting to become in some physical activity and perspiration became more problematic. Dr. Jaeger recommended flannel next to the skin should be the rule. Again, I quote, "It should come up to the neck and down to the middle of the thighs, with long sleeves to the wrists. This, with flannel drawers and a light-colored petticoat, is all that is needed for underwear." Sort of a lot. Soon the idea of reform underwear caught on, and other companies began manufacturing wool and cotton undergarments. Today, this reform underwear is known as thermal underwear, more recently called base layer. But the real focus of the underwear issue is corsetry. Women and men in certain periods have been altering their bodies by wearing stays. Here you can see, you can't see, but I can. There are images here on the lower right. You can see what looks like it's not a well-shaped corset in terms that it's rather straight. It's a corset for a young girl, and we're talking 8 or 9 years old. And there's one up there, and I don't know which one it is, that was a corset meant for negligee or nighttime support. Corsets were made of whalebone and later in the century and early 20th century steel. They fastened in front and then they were pulled very snugly in the back. And we all certainly remember Scarlett O'Hara. Corsetry was truly debilitating and injurious to women's health. You can see here how the tight lacing on the left really altered the shape of the rib cage and relocated the internal organs. And if you look at the image, the one on the right is, of course, a normal rib cage and normal. One woman remarks, "I was placed at the age of 15 in a fashionable school in London, and there it was the custom for the waists of the pupils to be reduced 1 inch per month until it was what the lady principal considered small enough. When I left school at 17, my waist measured only 13 inches, it formerly having been 23 inches in circumference." And yet corsetry was an integral part of 19th century society. It was part of their morality. A woman was not properly dressed or respectable without wearing a corset. It was highly desirable to have a smooth waistline, and so young children would wear a waist, which then evolved into a corset. Once a young girl had been corseted for many years, her back muscles atrophied, and as the deterioration progressed, her dependence on the corset increased. This perpetuated the myth that women had to wear a corset for support. This is a set of stays for an infant. Although they are not made out of whalebone, they were made out of a stiff caned material enough to put pressure on the abdomen. And I have to tell you, I'm going to diverse just a little bit here. I had the opportunity to look at a wonderful costume collection that was available in Reno, and she had thousands and thousands of things, and the one thing that was the grabber was an infant corset. Unfortunately, we were not able to acquire it, and it's really too bad, but you see the literature, and then you see it in reality, and it really did happen. Many physicians of the day supported and encouraged the use of corsetry for women, including Dr. Scott, who advertised for his electric corset. As you read this ad, you will see that the corset was charged with electromagnetism and that it is unbreakable. Corsets were commonly made from whalebone and with continued use could become brittle and eventually break. So this became very important. And then I love this at the very bottom, and you can barely see it down there. The corset was endorsed by the United States Surgeon General at the time, Dr. William A. Hammond. But having a stylish figure was what women wanted. It was desirable by men, and in this period, women defined themselves by their physical appearance and their ability to attract a man. This slide illustrates some young girls, possibly servants, looking through the keyhole to see how the lady of the house keeps her figure. But the corset also restricted women in the physical, moral, and political spheres. A woman could not work. It was physically impossible to raise her arm above her head, and so she became an immobile pedestal of success. And this brings up that idea that I introduced at the beginning, the theory of conspicuous consumption. And this was Thorsten Veblen, who stated that women's dress and their inability to work reflected the financial success of their husbands. At this time, most women wanted a successful husband. They wanted to wear these beautiful clothes, and they wanted to display their wealth and success through personal adornment. Corsetry was an integral part of eroticism. And here, as we look at this one, the man has placed his foot on the woman's back and is pulling those laces very tightly, and both of them have a smile on their face. But the issue of dress reform is beautifully stated by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps in her 1873 lecture titled, "What to Wear?" which states that contemporary fashions promote bad taste, bad hygiene, and bad morals. Unlike your grandmother, she continued, who dressed so sensibly and accomplished so much. You are dressed to kill. Of course, she is referring to killing yourselves. You are a victim of fashion. At this point in time, there were many articles written about dress reform and the ill effects of the traditional fashionable attire women's dress had on their health. So as you look at these two women, you can tell that they are both tightly corseted. Look at those waists. Look at the ridge line going up to the bust. It is very restricted and compressed. In as late as 1911, Warner's was stating that corsets were still a necessity, and I love this ad for a rust-proof corset, because the metal that was now used, should it get wet, could rust and bleed through to your outer garments. So you didn't want that. And I love the fact that you can see the women there swimming, and then the little Cupid is on a corset, and that's her lifeboat. It's going to save your life. As I have explained some of these 19th century fashions, you might be asking yourself, was there any time when a woman could enjoy some freedom in dress? And the answer is yes. It was called a Mother Hubbard or a wrapper, and it was a loose-fitting gown which was worn at home for very informal occasions. Mary McNair Matthews, the Irish widow who lived on the Comstock, stated in 1870 that she was shocked to see her neighbor answering her door in her wrapper. It was considered inappropriate to even come to the door, and it was like a bathrobe. This is a wrapper that's in our collection and was on exhibit at the Historical Society years ago. And you can see that it is loose and it would have been worn without a corset. This is the garment that I believe was worn by a woman when she was pregnant. It did allow for the growing midriff, but there were restrictions for this garment. According to one source, quote, the police had been ordered to suppress the Mother Hubbard costumes on the street. Such an order will not be welcomed by shy young things who have been in the habit of donning a loose flowing gown to their neighbor, to go to the grocery, or to their own water pump. Another diary reveals, I have cut out the dress Nellie sent me. Were I farther west, I dare not make it a Mother Hubbard, as the newspaper says that in Pendleton, Oregon, that type of costume is prohibited unless worn belted. Bills to that effect have been posted in town. Ladies who violate the ordinance being heavily fined. The alleged reason is that such garments scare horses, cause accidents. Once again, the alleged reason is that such garments scare horses, cause accidents, and ruin businesses. In Virginia City, there was an ordinance that stated women were not allowed to wear men's attire. Susie Marie, a wine proprietor, is requesting permission from the town alderman, like the city councilman, to wear men's clothing. And this is a great article, again, that Bob found, and we tried to find the answer, and it was never reported in the paper. So we don't know if she got her wish or not. So most women did dress according to the traditional styles. This is Major William Ormsby's wife, Margaret, in her stunning ball gown that she wore to the Territorial Legislative Ball in 1861. In 1869, Dr. Mary Walker, one of dress reform's most vocal supporters, arrived in White Pine County, Nevada, and there is a detailed account of her visit. Dr. Walker has got it and is trying her prettiest to keep the dress reform movement alive. And what she cannot do by talking, she does by walking the streets in the most grotesque garb. And the rest of this, a whole article, is about how horrible she is dressed. Here's Dr. Walker as she is aging. She was a physician, and she had been active in the Civil War. Because of her duties in the Civil War, according to one source, she was actually given a Congressional Medal of Honor and was allowed to wear men's garments. About 7 years later, Dr. Walker returns to Nevada, this time to Virginia City, and you can see the headlines, "The Breaches." A gloom has settled upon Virginia. Men go about with awe-stricken faces and slink into retired corners to shiver. The Breaches have arrived, and inside of them is Dr. Mary E. Walker. Unbeknownst to 19th century society, fashions did eventually change, but not before this article from Washington, D.C., which was printed in the Reno Gazette-Journal in 1889. I saw a sight one evening last week. I saw a woman go by on a bicycle. On a bicycle, I repeat, a vehicle with two wheels only, one of which was located directly behind the other. Her feet, not to use a stronger term, were on both sides of the connecting bar, balancing precisely as a man would. And her lower extremities were flopping and kicking in a lively manner. There was a flutter of lace and a flash of skirts whenever the respective ends of the walking beam went up, and I thought I had struck a crazy ballet dancer running away on a man's machine. I blushed, turned my face to the wall, resolved to gaze on the sight no more, but immediately turned back and resumed my investigations. When I bashfully withdrew my glance, there was only one of them. And now there was another, for another had galloped up and joined the first. Both were dressed in ordinary street costume of a lady, one wearing a jaunty hat and the other a bonnet. They were a sight of spectacles. What rational people had tried to do and failed, the bicycle did with success. The popularity of riding a bicycle opened up an entire new world to fashionable Victorians, that of sports and physical exercise. Many dress reformers had supported the idea of healthful movement, but until the bicycle became the rage, those ideas remained on the back burner. Now everyone was riding a bike, or at least wanting to. Here we see a woman in bloomers as the primary feature of this fashion plate. The popularity of cycling brought on renewed interest in bloomers. Bloomers were very adaptable to the idea of sports and physical education for women. And here you can see on the right is a bloomer costume, and on the left is a late 19th century gym outfit. And you can see the similarities in cut. The bloomer costume did not become acceptable attire yet, but it did evolve into functional dress for the newly emerging idea of women's sports and athletics. This image from a Delineator fashion magazine is encouraging women to move their bodies and participate in such sports as basketball. But notice that they are playing inside. We were still not allowed to play outside. So in fact, we have a pair of shoes in the collection that are early 1920s gym shoes, and the soles on the bottom of them are made out of fabric. You played inside. You did not play outside. And of course, we all know that bloomers became acceptable beach attire. Bathing dresses during the 1880s were still very burdensome by today's standards. They were either made of wool or cotton and included a bodice, usually with sleeves, full-length bloomers, and an overskirt, very similar to what Mrs. Bloomer had worn 50 years earlier. And this group of people is having fun by the sea. Men were beginning to expose more of themselves, and one of the women is in a very trendy bathing suit from 1895, and the other is a tad more modest and covered. And for my final slide, bloomers continued on as gym clothing for women, and this, of course, is from the 1920s. Thank you all very much. Interesting, isn't it? You don't really think about why we're all in pants. How did that happen? How did that transformation occur? And it really are all these social issues that brought it, and sports that brought it to the forefront. Question? Yeah, Ron. Ron.
My mother, she's 98, but she was going to high school. She wore bloomers. Then there was a transition, and they allowed people to wear shorts.
Well, I almost put this in the top. As a means of disclosure, I graduated from high school in 1968, and our gym costume was a white midi and blue bloomers, and they were shorts, but they had an elastic inner band, and they were called bloomers so the boys couldn't look up your shorts. That's what we were told. I think it's comical. And I wish I had kept them, I really do. Yes.
Hi, Dan. I just wondered, since all of this evolution really your talk centered on things in the Victorian era and the 1860s, etc., did one of my husband's relatives have any comments about that particular emergence of the bloomer, Lincoln's? Tricia Lincoln?
Say that to me one more time.
Did,
What was
did
the?
Abraham Lincoln have anything to say about?
Oh, Abraham Lincoln? Oh.
I haven't read all his quotes. I just wondered if you had.
Not that I'm aware of. I
You
don't.
probably did have something.
Well, I would think, when he was running for office and
Right.
the controversies that he faced, I wondered if anyone brought up, oh, what about women wearing bloomers? And
I don't know that, but I'm working on another talk actually, and there is a comment about Lincoln that a little girl wrote to him and said, "Please, Mr. Lincoln, won't you consider wearing facial hair?"
yeah.
She wanted him to have a beard, but I don't know anything about his comments about women's fashions at all.
I just
Sorry, Trish.
No, don't worry.
Yeah.
There's a really good book out about 4 years ago written by the seamstress for Mrs. Lincoln.
Uh-huh.
And it talked about all the goings on in the house, her costumes and things like that, and their sad life. But it's a very illuminating book.
I read it, and I can't remember the name.
Elizabeth Keckley.
Yes.
Yeah, Elizabeth
Keckley.
Keckley.
I thought it was the seamstress.
Seamstress, yes.
She was like a dressmaker, and she became a good friend of Mrs. Lincoln's.
Jan, what would you say, how did we wear pants today? Since when? 1960s, 1970s? When did pants become?
Second World War. Yeah.
I think probably during the Second World War, most women in the 20s and 30s still wore dresses, although we have an interesting garment that's actually owned by the Historical Society, which is a two-piece ensemble made by the Levi Strauss Company called Freedom Alls. And they're a pair of trousers with a long jacket. And they are unique for a number of factors in that they were only manufactured for 1 year in 1918. So they must not have caught on right away. But we've also seen photographs, and Frances Humphreys in one of our major photographic collections has a number of photos as a young girl in the 20s riding in an automobile in trousers. But I don't think for regular school wear, work wear, it wasn't until maybe the 40s that we really start seeing it every day. And then, even when I was in high school, we had to wear dresses. So, yes.
I started teaching school in the mid-50s, and we were not allowed as female teachers to wear pants to teach until 1971. Wow.
71. Fabulous. Yes, yes.
When I was in college, you couldn't wear pants. That was in the
We had to wear raincoats over them.
I live in West Virginia. It's a cold state. I was born in 1945, and I can remember wearing pants to school. Wherever we did.
You were much
Where
more
was
the
the else?
rest of us. No, I don't, in high school, we were not allowed to wear pants.
Gym suits are much more advanced than we were talking about. Weird.
Could be cultural, regional differences.
All of my, I went to private Christian schools and I was born in '53, so elementary school, playing on the monkey bars and stuff. Our mothers, all my girlfriends and I, we wore shorts under our skirts. We had to wear skirts to school, but we couldn't go on the monkey bars unless we had them.
Shorts on, interesting. Yes.
I went to school, all through school in Southern California and graduated in '69. They didn't allow pants even in high school until '72.
Yeah,
And
71
that was
or
Southern
72.
California.
I think that's about right. Yes.
We want to talk about the slow march of progress. We could not wear pants in the Nevada legislature until 1993.
Wow. I didn't know that. And I remember reading an article Senator Jacobson made some strong comments about. And after he's not with us, we can talk about it. Do you remember that? Yes, yeah.
I went to Douglas High School, and I graduated in '64, and it was 1962 before we could wear pants. And we're a ranching community. You know, that's practical.
That's interesting, Judy. That's real interesting. How funny. Yeah.
I graduated from 1970 and they started wearing pants after I graduated. But what upset me, because here I walked to school with snow up to my knees with a dress on, and when I was a kid, and these people had moved down from Alaska, and they of course, and this is when I was in grade school, they were already wearing pants to school, and I'm going, this is no fair. They get snow, they get to wear pants. We get snow, and we still have to wear dresses.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But I think we
Revolution going on.
Yeah, Trish.
So I was something of a rebel talking about this. I went to private Christian schools in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I graduated in '71. In my senior year of high school, so this is 1970, my mother said to me, I was a seamstress all my life. I made my own clothes, and I would wear nice pantsuits that I made, designed and made, to church, to the Dutch Christian Reformed Church every Sunday. My mother finally said, this is silly. You make these clothes, you can wear them to church, wear them to school. So I go to school the Monday before Thanksgiving in 1970, wearing my nice pantsuit that I'd worn to church the day before, and they sent me home. Well, they called my mother. She had to pick me up, and they said she can't wear pants at school. And my mother said she's been wearing pants under her skirt her whole life. Why can't she? Anyway, she wore them to church. So my mother sends me to school the next morning in the pantsuit, and they call her to the office. I have to go home, and she brings clothes that time. I go back to school. That night, they had an emergency meeting of the school board, and they changed the dress code starting the Monday after Thanksgiving to girls could wear pants to school, but they could not have orange stitching or rivets.
Oh, how interesting.
I did that in my high school in 1970.
Yay!
But I didn't really, I knew I was something of a rebel for there, but I didn't realize I was so ahead of some of the West Coast schools. I'm quite shocked. Grand Rapids, Michigan, Great Lakes.
Very good. Any other questions? I think it's sort of an interesting story. I really do, about how this happened and how the dress reform movement tried so hard, and it didn't make any sense at the time. And now, of course, everything is changed. So.
Thank you for coming tonight. Let's get started.